Everyone thought a $5 fine couldn't ruin a life. They were wrong. They never saw the storm brewing behind the quiet gates of our neighborhood, the kind of storm that waits patiently until the moment it can strike. I remember the day like it was etched in fire. The sun was just dipping behind the oaks lining our street, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward my house, as if warning me something was coming. I was inside, sipping cold coffee, scrolling through emails when the first notice came. HOA, a fine, $5, ridiculous, almost laughable. But the tone, the way the letter screamed authority, it wasn't just a fine. It was a warning, an intrusion into our lives, an assertion that they owned us, our home, our peace. I crumpled the paper in my hand, trying to laugh, but laughter didn't come. Not when every fiber of my being knew something darker was underneath. They didn't knock, they didn't politely ask. They came with badges that weren't real, threats that weren't legal, and the kind of audacity only someone who truly believes they are untouchable could muster. I heard the knock that echoed like a gunshot across the wooden floor. Strong, commanding, insistent. My heart froze. I wasn't expecting company, certainly not at this hour. And then I saw her through the window. HOA president, a woman with sharp eyes, tighter than any armor I'd ever seen in my life. She carried that look of moral superiority, the kind that convinces you that questioning her is not just rebellion, it's a personal betrayal. Her lips were curled slightly, a smirk that said, "I am above you." Behind her, a pair of men I would later realize were pretending to be law enforcement. Fake badges glinting in the fading light, but fake courage doesn't disguise fear. I knew she underestimated me. The air between us thickened. Silence stretched long enough to become unbearable. Then a voice cut through, a voice calm, measured, yet carrying the weight of someone who had walked through fire and returned without flinching. My son's voice. "Mom, who's at the door?" I froze, my son, my pride, my protector. A special forces veteran who had walked through the kind of chaos that would break ordinary men and women. And now here he was, standing behind me, alert, eyes sharp, reading the tension like a living radar. The woman at the door didn't know that the house she was about to invade was already prepared for a confrontation far beyond her imagination. They tried their usual threats, their loud proclamations, the kind that usually cow people into obedience. "We're here to enforce the rules. You must pay immediately." The words were hollow, rehearsed, desperate. I could see the cracks in their composure, but my son didn't speak yet. He didn't need to. Presence is louder than words, and his presence filled the room, commanding, protective, silent but deafening in its warning. I watched her falter even for a second. A woman who had never faced anyone who wouldn't cower under her fake authority. She hadn't met anyone like him. My heart pounded, a mixture of fear and pride as I realized the tide had already turned. And then the moment that would replay in my mind for months, a pause long enough for the tension to become unbearable, her smirk vanished. She hadn't expected him. Not the way he stood, shoulders squared, eyes unyielding, a calm readiness radiating from every line of his body. And the realization hit her. This wasn't just a homeowner defending her rights. This was someone trained to face danger, someone who had stared down threats that could end lives in seconds, someone whose silence was louder than any argument she could muster. For a heartbeat, she seemed human, just a flicker. And then panic. The kind that corrodes confidence faster than any word can. I saw it in her eyes before she tried to hide it with authority again. I knew in that moment the battle was over before it began, not because of money, not because of rules, but because dignity, experience, and courage don't require permission to exist. And as the shadows lengthened across our living room, I realized something terrifying. This fight wasn't over. The HOA didn't just care about a fine. They cared about control, about dominance, about breaking the spirit of those who dared to resist. But now they had awakened a force they didn't understand. And that's when I knew what came next would change everything. She thought she could intimidate me with her little parade of authority, but the second she stepped across my threshold, the air changed. You could feel it like a storm pressing down on the calm before the lightning strikes. I didn't move. My son didn't move, yet somehow the room vibrated with the power of our silence. It's amazing how a single presence can change the entire energy of a space. And in that moment her eyes flicked, searching for weakness, for hesitation. But there was none. She tried again, louder this time. "You will pay the fine now, you have no choice." Her voice cracked, betraying the first hints of fear she didn't even know she was carrying. I watched her posture shift ever so slightly. The kind of subtle retreat that only someone with combat awareness can spot. My son's eyes, cold, calculating, tracked every micro-movement. He didn't speak yet, but his patience was a weapon as sharp as any blade. And then the thing she underestimated most, me. I stepped forward. Not angrily, not out of fear, but with the quiet certainty of someone who has lived a life with consequences far heavier than any HOA fine. I met her gaze, and the room seemed to shrink. It wasn't just my voice that carried. It was the unspoken warning, you are not in control here. I've read your letters, I said slowly. Every threat, every demand, you've crossed lines you don't even understand, and I think you're about to find out exactly what that means. Her smirk tried to return, but it trembled. Fake confidence is fragile. It cracks the moment someone refuses to bow to it. And then, as if on cue, the men behind her shifted nervously. Fake badges, fake authority, real fear. They had counted on a silent, scared homeowner. Not a veteran's family, not a force ready to defend every inch of their home. I could almost see the gears turning in her mind. She had done this before in so many quiet homes, leaving fear and compliance in her wake. But she hadn't faced someone who had stared into real danger and returned unbroken. Someone whose training taught them that hesitation could cost lives. And now, her little parade of threats seemed absurd, almost childish, against the quiet, lethal patience of my son and me. "You're not leaving," she hissed. "This is my house, my rules." I laughed, a single, dry, controlled laugh that carried more weight than her entire authority. "Your rules?" I echoed. "This is my home, not yours. You may have your letters, your threats, your little gang pretending to be police, but none of that matters here." And then he spoke. My son, calm, precise, every word measured like a scalpel cutting through the tension. "Step outside, now." His tone wasn't a request, it wasn't even a warning, it was inevitability, the kind of statement that cannot be bargained with, only obeyed. Her eyes widened. I could see the thought forming. I didn't plan for this, I didn't anticipate this. I can't win. But she tried to cover it, a faint, brittle smile, the kind people use when they're bluffing and hope no one notices. The kind of smile that cracks under pressure. The men shuffled behind her, looking for an escape, but the door had closed behind them. I didn't lock it. It didn't need locking. The presence in that room was lock enough. My son's training, his calm, his readiness, everything screamed consequences too severe to risk. And still she pressed. "You will comply. This is for the good of the neighborhood." Her voice was rising now, desperation leaking through every syllable. But I had seen this before, people who thought control was power, who didn't understand the difference between fear and respect. "Good of the neighborhood?" I asked softly, leaning just enough forward to match her gaze. "Tell me, is terrorizing your neighbors the definition of good? Because that's what you're doing, and it stops now." The pause that followed could have been measured in lifetimes. You could feel the tension coil in the room, waiting to strike. Then she did something that shocked me, a small, almost imperceptible falter. The first crack in her armor. A tiny step backward, hesitation flashing in her eyes. I knew then that the tide had turned irrevocably. And as she glanced around, desperate for an exit, I could almost hear the internal countdown in her head. The realization that she had gambled on intimidation and lost. That her little kingdom of rules and fines and threats had collided with a family unwilling to bend, and a son trained in a world where hesitation could mean death. She tried to rally, tried to regain control, but the room had shifted. Authority that relied on fear cannot survive courage. It cannot survive integrity. She saw it in our eyes, in the quiet readiness that radiated off every inch of my son, in my own calm, unwavering stance. This wasn't a home to bully. This was a fortress built from experience, love, and unshakable resolve. And in that charged silence, I realized something crucial. This wasn't just about a $5 fine anymore. It had never been about the money. It was about control, about arrogance, about the false belief that people can be owned through fear. And in that moment, as I stood with my son beside me, I understood the truth of every life lesson I had learned along the way. Real power comes not from rules or threats. It comes from courage, from conviction, and from protecting what you love with everything you are. She blinked, and in that instant, the entire weight of her assumptions, her entitlement, her plan for domination began to crumble. She had underestimated the one thing she could never control, a family who refused to be intimidated. And I knew, as her face paled and she faltered again, that what came next would leave an impression she, and the entire HOA, would never forget. She thought she had a plan. She thought the letters, the threats, the fake authority would bend us. But plans are fragile, especially when they collide with experience, courage, and the quiet, unwavering determination of someone who has stared at death and lived. I could see her calculations faltering in real time, every tiny hesitation betraying the cracks in her confidence. The room was tense, the kind of tension that presses on your chest, makes every heartbeat sound like a drum roll. My son didn't move. He didn't need to. Presence alone can be louder than any weapon, and in that moment he became the storm she never anticipated. "You don't understand," she spat, trying to regain control. "This isn't just a fine, this is about rules, about keeping order." I shook my head slowly, the weight of years behind the motion. "Order," I said, my voice low, deliberate. "Order doesn't need threats, it doesn't need intimidation. Real order comes from respect, from integrity, from understanding that people aren't pawns in your game." Her eyes narrowed, desperation creeping in. She realized she couldn't bully me into submission, she couldn't scare my son into compliance, and the very thing she relied on, fear, was now powerless. "Step outside," he said again, his voice calm, unflinching. "Now." She hesitated, one small step, a foot hovering near the threshold. I could see the internal battle waging, authority versus survival, pride versus reason. She hadn't expected resistance like this. She had never faced someone who could measure her every move, anticipate every lie, and wait until the perfect moment to act. Then she tried a new tactic, manipulation. "Think of your neighbors, think of the community, you can't defy the rules." Her words were fast now, laced with panic, like a storm trying to convince the sun to hide. I leaned slightly forward. My voice, steady, calm, carried the weight of certainty. "We are your neighbors, and we will not be intimidated. You confuse fear with respect. You mistake authority for strength, but real strength, real courage, is in standing for what is right even when it's hard, and this stops now." I could see it flicker in her eyes, the realization that she had misjudged everything. And as she hesitated, the men behind her shifted nervously. Fake badges, fake courage, real fear. Their bravado evaporated in the presence of someone who didn't just talk about strength, someone who embodied it. You don't know who you're dealing with," she finally hissed, voice breaking, trying to reclaim control. I smiled faintly. "No," I said, "I think you do know who you're dealing with, but you're about to find out." It was then that the moment crystallized, the moment where everything we had prepared for, everything we had feared, became real. She made a move, a step forward, hand raised as if to signal some imaginary authority ready to seize what she believed was hers by right. But she hadn't accounted for him. My son, calm, collected, ready, lethal if necessary. One glance and she froze. For a heartbeat, I wondered if she truly understood the gravity of the situation. If she realized that she had not just overstepped, but that her actions could have consequences far beyond a letter or a fine. And in that silence, I saw something remarkable, the crack in her mask. The faint, terrified realization that she had walked into a storm she couldn't control. Her hand wavered, her breath caught. She tried to regain authority with words, but they faltered, weak and trembling. We didn't move, we didn't speak. The room held its breath with us, and then she stepped back, one small, hesitant step. Another. And suddenly the aura of power she had cultivated for months, maybe years, vanished. I could feel it in the walls, in the air, in the almost tangible tension that hung over the room. The false strength of authority is fragile, and in that fragile moment, she realized she was not in control. She never had been. She started, her voice small, almost childlike in its uncertainty. You can't." "You can't what?" I asked softly, letting my words hang in the room like a mirror, reflecting her own fear back at her. "Take control, make threats, intimidate. You already tried and it failed. You thought a fine, a letter, a badge could bend us. But here we are, unbroken, unafraid, unbowed." Her eyes darted to my son, searching for some hint of weakness, some small crack in the armor. But there was none. He didn't move, didn't blink, didn't give her anything to grasp. He was calm, silent, a living warning she hadn't anticipated. And I realized something profound in that moment. Courage isn't loud. Courage doesn't announce itself. It simply exists, quietly, firmly, unshakable. The men behind her looked at each other, their facade crumbling. I could almost hear their thoughts. We didn't plan for this. We didn't think anyone would resist like this. We can't win. And the woman, the president, the architect of this charade, she faltered. Panic replaced her smirk. Authority gave way to survival instinct. And suddenly, the entire dynamic had shifted. No more letters. No more threats. No more false authority. Just a family standing firm and the stark reality that courage, experience, and unwavering resolve outweigh every hollow badge and empty threat. She finally stepped back entirely, words faltering, composure shattered. And in that instant, I understood something crucial. This wasn't a fight about money. It had never been about a $5 fine. It was about control, arrogance, and the false belief that people can be dominated through fear. And as her face paled, her little parade of intimidation crumbling around her, I realized something even more important. The HOA had just learned a lesson it would never forget. One simple truth: you don't underestimate a family prepared to defend what is theirs. She retreated, but retreat doesn't erase audacity. The look in her eyes screamed it. She would return, she would plot, she would find another way. I could feel it in the silence that followed, thick and suffocating like the calm before a hurricane. My son remained still, eyes scanning every shadow, every corner of the room, measuring threats we didn't yet fully see. I could see the tension in her retreating steps, a mixture of fear and disbelief. She hadn't anticipated resistance. She hadn't expected courage, training, or the quiet, lethal patience of someone who had survived far worse than a rogue HOA president. And in that retreat, I sensed the birth of something dangerous: obsession. HOAs thrive on control, on submission, on the illusion that a neighborhood can be ruled by fear, by arbitrary rules, by petty fines that seem harmless until you're the target. And now we had shattered that illusion. But shattering illusions often breeds revenge. She would plan, she would scheme, and the fight was far from over. I looked at my son, calm, poised, unwavering. There's a moment in life when you realize that the people you love carry more than just memories. They carry power, courage, and the willingness to stand for what's right. And in that instant, I felt pride so intense it was almost painful. He wasn't just my son. He was a force of nature, and together we were an unbreakable wall. But the HOA doesn't understand walls. They understand compliance, fear, and manipulation. And when those fail, they escalate. That's when the letters started arriving in bulk. Threats disguised as policy, legal jargon masquerading as law, every page a testament to their refusal to accept that they had been defeated, not by brute force, but by conviction. We ignored most of them. Some were almost comical, filled with errors and contradictions that revealed more about their incompetence than our supposed defiance. Others, however, were more sinister. Suggestive warnings about neighbors, hints at investigations, the subtle threat that all avenues would be explored if we continued to resist. And I realized as I read them that this was no longer a simple matter. It had escalated into a war of wills. The tension at home grew. Every knock on the door, every unfamiliar car in the driveway set my nerves on edge. The neighborhood itself seemed to pulse with anticipation, as if the trees and streets were witnesses to a battle invisible to the untrained eye. And through it all, my son remained our shield, quiet but ever watchful, ready for the moment when action would be required. And then came the escalation, the audacity that defied belief. She called officials, local law enforcement, claiming violation of rules, trespassing, and a litany of nonsense designed to frighten, confuse, and intimidate. I could almost hear the smirk in her voice as she made the call, believing she had finally summoned an unchallengeable force. She hadn't counted on experience, on foresight, on the presence of someone trained to navigate chaos and deception. When the deputies arrived, calm and professional, they were met not by fear but by clarity. We presented facts, evidence, and the truth, that her authority was overstated, that her threats were baseless, that her so-called enforcers had no legal standing. And slowly the tide began to turn again, not just in our favor, but in the quiet humiliation of the HOA president. Her reactions were priceless. Panic, frustration, and disbelief flickered across her face as the officials listened politely, nodded, and then left with a polite explanation. The law didn't support her claims. She tried to protest, to argue, to assert some semblance of control, but her words fell flat. The very thing she had weaponized against us, rules, authority, intimidation, was now useless. Yet the battle didn't end there. The emotional strain was heavy. Sleepless nights, whispered plans, the constant awareness that any day could bring another escalation. Fear was no longer a tool, it was a companion. But fear, when faced with preparation, courage, and unity, can be transformed. We learned to anticipate, to prepare, to stand firm. And every letter, every knock, every attempt at intimidation became an opportunity to reaffirm our resolve. And then the moment that would become legendary in our circle. She tried to send someone to inspect the property, an auditor, a compliance officer. I watched the car pull into the driveway, familiar with the type, familiar with the purpose, and I knew exactly what to do. My son positioned himself where they could be seen but not threatened, projecting authority without violence. I met the driver at the door, calm, polite, controlled. And in that exchange, the truth became clear. She was running out of options. Her threats had failed. Her intimidation had crumbled. And now, even her allies were beginning to hesitate. It was a lesson in patience, in strategy, in the power of standing firm. Sometimes, the most effective defense isn't a confrontation. It's the quiet demonstration of readiness, competence, and the unwillingness to be manipulated. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the aura of control she had cultivated began to fade. The neighborhood began to whisper, notices and rumors of her failures spreading quietly, the cracks in her authority visible to everyone. And I realized something profound. Fear is only powerful when hidden. When exposed, it collapses under its own weight. And the moral was clear: courage doesn't need to shout. It simply exists, and in its existence it dismantles false power piece by piece. And in that stillness, as night fell over the house, I understood the depth of what we had accomplished. This wasn't about victory or revenge. It was about dignity. It was about teaching that courage, integrity, and preparation outweigh arrogance and intimidation. And as we sat together, weary but unbroken, I knew the battle was far from over, but the HOA had learned a truth it would never forget. Some forces cannot be bent. Some families cannot be broken. She didn't give up. That much was clear. By now, her letters had evolved into a campaign, each one sharper, more aggressive, dripping with veiled threats. Every page was designed to unsettle, to remind us that she had power, or at least she thought she did. But we had seen behind the curtain. We had seen the machinery of control and realized it was fragile, hollow, dependent entirely on fear. Yet fear has a way of seeping in even when you're prepared. Every knock on the door made my pulse quicken. Every glance at the mailbox carried a little tension. I could feel it in the walls of the house, a quiet pressure, a reminder that the battle was far from over. And through it all, my son remained a calm sentinel, silent but unwavering, a presence that anchored me even when the stress threatened to overwhelm. Then came the audacious escalation. She tried to manipulate the neighbors, whispered stories, half-truths, rumors of noncompliance, of us being difficult, of us breaking invisible rules that didn't exist. I heard about it from passing neighbors, from subtle glances, from questions carefully phrased to gauge our reaction. She wanted isolation, control, the subtle erasure of support. But she underestimated one thing: truth has a way of revealing itself, and people can see courage when it's real. It was during one of those quiet afternoons, while I sorted through another wave of notices, that my son leaned forward, his brow furrowed, a subtle tension in his posture. "They're escalating," he said, not as a warning, not as panic, but as fact. His experience, his training, gave him the ability to read threats not just as words, but as intent. And in that calm observation, I realized the depth of what we were facing. This wasn't petty HOA nonsense anymore. It was obsession, a test of endurance, a battle of wills. Then it happened, the first direct intrusion, not a letter, not a knock, but a presence. Her agents, pretending to be officials, arriving at our driveway under the guise of inspection. I could see the arrogance in their steps, the smirk of entitlement on their faces. They thought we would flinch, that we would comply, that the $5 fine and her words were enough to bend us. But she hadn't accounted for him, my son. His posture shifted subtly, almost imperceptibly, a demonstration of readiness. He moved between us and the intruders, calm, measured, projecting authority without aggression, warning without speaking. I met their eyes as they reached for papers, for documentation, for some invisible compliance they believed we owed. And in that moment, they realized something: they were not in control. "Do you have identification?" I asked calmly, watching the smallest hesitation creep across their faces. Their scripted confidence faltered. My son stepped slightly forward, silent, but the aura of experience radiating from him was enough to unsettle even the most confident imposters. They had expected fear, or at least compliance. What they found was clarity, preparation, and an unwillingness to be manipulated. The standoff was brief but intense, a quiet clash of wills with no words spoken. They shuffled awkwardly, realizing their facade was crumbling, and then in a subtle, almost imperceptible retreat they left. One glance over their shoulders at us, and it was clear, this was not a home to bully. This was a home protected by resolve, by experience, by courage that could not be intimidated. In the aftermath, the letters intensified. Threats now mingled with hints at legal action, claims of violations, insinuations that we were creating a hostile environment. It was relentless, exhausting, emotional fatigue set in. I would lie awake at night, thinking about the next move, the next escalation, the next wave of chaos she might send our way. And yet, through every sleepless night, through every letter, through every attempt at manipulation, I found strength in the calm presence beside me. My son, ever vigilant, ever steady, was more than a shield. He was a reminder of why we fought. And then came the revelation. The HOA president's obsession had become public. Whispers among neighbors, subtle comments, subtle warnings, hints at her overreach. She was losing control, not just over us, but over perception itself. The community, once a silent audience to her authority, was beginning to see the cracks. And in that slow, inevitable revelation, I realized something profound. Courage doesn't just protect, it inspires. People notice when someone refuses to bow, refuses to be intimidated, refuses to accept injustice quietly. But she didn't stop. Desperation breeds audacity. Her next move was almost laughable if it weren't so brazen. She attempted to co-opt local authorities, presenting distorted facts, trying to manipulate the law to her advantage. Her arrogance blinded her to one simple truth: honesty, preparation, and integrity are harder to manipulate than fear. When the authorities arrived, calm and professional, they listened, asked questions, and slowly the truth unraveled before them. Her smirk faltered. Panic replaced confidence. Authority, hollow and dependent on deception, crumbled. We watched carefully, silently, as her little empire of intimidation unraveled. Not with anger, not with confrontation, but with patience, clarity, and resolve. The moral became clear. True power is not in intimidation. True power is in standing firm, in preparation, in refusing to be bent. By the time night fell, the house was quiet, but the weight of what had happened lingered. Exhaustion mixed with relief, fear mixed with pride. And I realized something essential. The battle wasn't just about a $5 fine. It was about dignity, courage, and the unshakable resolve of a family who refused to be intimidated. And as my son and I sat together, the silence spoke louder than any words, a testament to strength, to preparation, and to the enduring power of standing for what is right. The HOA had learned something crucial that day. Some forces cannot be bent. Some families cannot be broken. And some lessons, once learned, leave an impression that lasts far longer than any letter, any threat, any attempt at intimidation. The next morning, the air felt different. Heavy, almost electric, as if the neighborhood itself sensed the storm that had been quietly brewing for weeks. She hadn't given up, not by a long shot. The letters had slowed, but the undercurrent of threat was still there, subtle, insidious, the kind you feel before you see. My son noticed it immediately. Even before the mail hit the counter, his eyes scanned the street, every car, every shadow, every movement. He had learned long ago that vigilance is not paranoia, it's survival. And survival was exactly what we needed now, because she had escalated. The HOA president wasn't content with letters anymore. This was personal. Every note, every whisper, every subtle attempt to manipulate neighbors and authority now carried a venomous intent. She wanted control, not compliance, not respect, control, and she would do anything to achieve it. That's when the first real test arrived. A knock at the door, not firm, not polite, but deliberate, confident, calculated. I froze for a moment, feeling the tension coil in the room like a spring ready to snap. My son moved beside me, quiet, steady, the presence of someone who has faced danger and returned intact. His gaze was sharp, unyielding, piercing the tension like a knife through fog. On the other side of the door was a woman in a crisp uniform, a badge glinting under the morning sun. "Good morning," she said smoothly. We're here to inspect compliance with HOA regulations. A professional tone, calm, polite. But even she carried a hint of doubt. Something in her posture suggested she sensed the storm waiting behind the door. I opened the door slowly, allowing just enough space to control the interaction without aggression. "Of course," I said, calm, measured. "Let's talk." Inside, my son moved subtly, positioning himself between us and the threshold, a silent guardian exuding authority without a single word. The woman glanced around, her eyes flicking toward him, and I saw the moment her confidence faltered. She had expected fear, obedience, compliance, but what she saw was readiness. Calm, precise, unshakable readiness. And the unspoken message was clear: this was not a home to intimidate. This was a home defended by courage, by experience, by conviction. She tried to maintain professionalism, citing regulations, quoting bylaws, referencing fines and penalties. Her voice remained polite, but subtle cracks betrayed her growing unease. She hadn't anticipated someone who could navigate chaos calmly without flinching. And slowly, the encounter began to shift. The tide, once assumed to be in her favor, turned inch by inch. My son spoke quietly, deliberately, answering questions without aggression, presenting facts calmly, exposing inconsistencies in her claims. I added details, context, everything measured to maintain authority without escalating tension unnecessarily. And with each passing moment, I could feel her veneer of control cracking. It wasn't dramatic, not like a movie fight scene. It was quiet, precise, strategic. The kind of confrontation where every word matters, every pause carries weight, and every glance can shift the outcome. And by the time she left, polite but visibly shaken, the HOA president's plan had begun to unravel. But she wouldn't stop. Obsession drives people further than reason ever could. And by the next week, she had escalated again, attempting to manipulate the neighbors, spreading rumors, trying to isolate us socially, hoping that fear and gossip would bend our resolve. She didn't understand one thing: courage is contagious. Integrity cannot be hidden. And in the subtle whispers of the neighborhood, people began to see the truth. They began to notice the courage, the preparation, the unyielding resolve of a family refusing to bow. And then came the turning point. The audacity of her escalation was almost unbelievable. She attempted to involve authorities again, this time with falsified claims of violations and noncompliance, hoping that legal intervention would force us to submit. It was bold, reckless, and almost laughable if it weren't so serious. When the officials arrived, my son and I met them calmly, presenting evidence, facts, and clarity. No anger, no intimidation, just truth. And the reaction was instantaneous. The veneer of control she had carefully cultivated for months dissolved in the face of reason and preparation. Panic flickered across her face as she realized that authority, when backed by falsehood, is fragile. I watched her falter, watched the arrogance melt into desperation. Her strategy had failed. Her plan to intimidate, to manipulate, to dominate had been dismantled with patience, courage, and precision. And in that quiet moment, I felt a profound truth settle within me. Real power does not come from threats or rules. It comes from standing firm, from preparation, from the courage to protect what is yours. The battle wasn't over. The HOA president still loomed, still schemed, still tried to assert control in subtle ways. But the momentum had shifted irreversibly. She had underestimated what she faced. She had misjudged us. And in that miscalculation lay her vulnerability. And as the neighborhood slowly began to notice, neighbors whispering, observing, questioning her authority, I realized something deeper. Courage, integrity, and preparation do not just protect. They inspire. They reveal truth to those around us. And the silent lessons we were teaching were far more powerful than any confrontation, any threat, any letter could ever be. That night, as I looked around our home, I felt the weight of the weeks pressing down. The tension, the fear, the uncertainty. But it was balanced by relief, by pride, by the knowledge that we had faced the storm and remained intact. My son, silent and vigilant, remained the anchor in the chaos, a living reminder that preparation, courage, and conviction can withstand almost anything. And in that quiet reflection, I understood the depth of what we were facing. This wasn't about a $5 fine. It never had been. It was about control, power, arrogance, and the belief that others can be intimidated. And it was about showing that courage, resolve, and dignity are stronger than any threat. The HOA president had been confronted not just by facts, not just by truth, but by the unyielding presence of a family unwilling to bend. And in that, a lesson was quietly learned. Some forces cannot be broken. Some families cannot be intimidated. And some truths, once revealed, cannot be forgotten. She thought she had one last trick left, a final push to regain control. But desperation has a smell, a weight, a way of clouding judgment that no amount of planning can fix. I could sense it in every email, every subtle threat, every whisper of intimidation that made its way to our doorstep. She was running out of options, and the recklessness in her eyes was growing with every passing hour. It started with the call. A formal notice this time, stamped with official-looking seals, demanding entry to our property, inspection of the violations, and compliance under threat of penalties we knew she had no right to enforce. Her confidence in this document was almost laughable, until you consider the fear she intended it to instill. She thought paperwork could bend reality, that her little empire of authority could intimidate those who refused to bow. My son read the notice first, his expression unreadable, calm, precise. Then he handed it to me, his eyes meeting mine with the quiet understanding of someone trained to anticipate chaos. "They're escalating," he said, not fearfully, not aggressively, simply stating a fact. And in that simple acknowledgement, we both knew that this confrontation would not be another negotiation. This was the moment she hoped would break us. The day she arrived, it was late afternoon. Shadows stretched across the lawn, sharp, dramatic, as if even the sun itself sensed the tension. She came with her usual entourage, faces masked with false confidence. But she didn't know we were ready, not just ready, prepared. My son positioned himself strategically inside, his presence a shield, a warning, a calm authority that radiated strength without aggression. I moved alongside him, confident, steady, every action deliberate, every glance controlled. "You will comply," she demanded, her voice rising, the first hints of panic breaking through her practiced calm. "This is your final warning. We will enforce the rules." I smiled faintly. "Rules?" I echoed. "This is my home, and your rules, your threats, your intimidation end at the threshold of my door." Her face tightened, the first cracks in her armor fully visible. And then she made her move, the one she had been planning, rehearsing, hoping would succeed. She tried to step across the line to assert dominance physically, to force compliance. But she hadn't accounted for him. My son, calm, steady, unyielding, one subtle step from him and she froze. The pause stretched long enough to feel every heartbeat, every breath, the tension thick as storm clouds. Her smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of panic. She realized that what she had intended as a simple enforcement had become a confrontation with someone who could not be intimidated, someone whose calm alone carried the weight of experience, authority, and readiness. "You're not leaving," she said, almost pleading now, desperation threading through her words. "This is your responsibility, your obligation." I shook my head slowly, deliberate. "Obligation? You confuse fear with compliance. You mistake authority for power. You are wrong." And in that moment, something shifted irreversibly. The neighborhood had begun to gather silently, curious, cautious, drawn by the tension, the clash of wills. They didn't see the danger, they saw courage. They saw someone standing unflinchingly against petty tyranny. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tide began to turn. Her final attempt at intimidation crumbled under the weight of truth and presence. Letters, threats, faux authority, they all failed. And then the realization hit her fully. She had miscalculated. She had underestimated the force she confronted, the family she thought could be bent, the son who embodied vigilance, training, and courage. Her empire of fear had collapsed silently, invisibly, but utterly. The silent witnesses, neighbors, passers-by, even some who had once been loyal to her, watched in awe as the confrontation dissolved without a single raised hand. The moral was clear. Real strength doesn't need aggression. Real authority doesn't need intimidation. Courage, preparation, and integrity are more powerful than any bluff, any badge, any letter. And in her defeat, there was something almost tragic. Not because she lost, but because she refused to see the lesson hidden in plain sight. That power obtained through fear is temporary. That control built on intimidation is fragile. That arrogance blinds even the most confident until reality cannot be denied. By the end of that day, the HOA president had retreated, not with dignity, not with strategy, but with a quiet, defeated panic that spoke louder than any words. And I realized something profound. This was more than a victory over one person. It was a vindication of every quiet act of courage we had practiced, every moment of preparation, every ounce of patience and resolve. The neighborhood slowly began to shift in perception. The whispers, once carefully curated to intimidate, now worked in reverse. People began to see her for what she was, someone who wielded fear as a weapon and failed. Courage, in contrast, was visible, undeniable, contagious. And finally, in that charged silence, I felt the weight of all we had endured. Weeks of tension, exhaustion, emotional strain, all of it culminated in a quiet triumph. Not explosive, not violent, but deeply satisfying. We had faced audacity, arrogance, and obsession, and we had remained unbroken. My son stood silently beside me, a calm sentinel. The storm had passed, at least for now. But I knew the lessons we had learned would linger. Courage cannot be faked. Resolve cannot be intimidated. And some forces, once awakened, once prepared, cannot be broken. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the lawn, I understood the full impact of that day. Not just for us, not just for the HOA, but for the invisible truth it carried, that dignity, courage, and integrity are more powerful than fear, more powerful than threats, more powerful than any $5 fine or hollow authority. And in that realization, the final twist revealed itself, quietly, unexpectedly, as it often does in life. She hadn't just underestimated us. She had underestimated the community, the truth, and the unyielding force of a family who refused to bend. And that, more than anything, was her defeat. The morning after her last failed attempt, there was a stillness in the air that felt almost sacred. A quiet victory had been won, but it wasn't about gloating or vengeance or even proving a point. It was about dignity, about standing unbroken in the face of arrogance, and about showing that courage, patience, and integrity always carry weight far beyond threats or fines. The neighborhood had begun to shift subtly. Whispers of her failures spread like wildfire, invisible threads of truth weaving through the community. Those who had once feared her authority now looked differently. Some even approached cautiously, hesitant, wanting to understand how we had withstood the storm. Others simply watched from a distance, eyes wide, silently acknowledging the courage they had witnessed. And all of them saw something that can't be faked: the quiet, unyielding presence of a family who refused to be intimidated. My son remained a silent sentinel, ever vigilant, yet somehow the tension in the house had lifted. The weight of potential confrontation, the fear that had shadowed every step for weeks, began to ease. But there was still one final moment left, a reckoning not just with her, but with the lessons embedded in the struggle itself. She tried one last time, of course. A call, a thinly veiled threat, a hint at legal escalation, her voice brimming with false confidence. But this time I didn't hesitate. I didn't falter. I met her words with calm clarity, citing facts, evidence, and boundaries she had no right to cross. There was no aggression, no intimidation, only the unwavering force of truth. And for the first time I heard her falter. Her defenses cracked visibly. The letters, the threats, the imagined authority, they had all failed. And in that crack I realized something profound. Arrogance always collapses when confronted with courage. Threats only hold power over those who lack conviction, and preparation, patience, and resolve are stronger than any attempt at fear. The neighborhood watched quietly as the reality settled. She could scream, write, threaten, or manipulate, but the truth was immutable. She had overstepped. She had misjudged the people she sought to control, and in the aftermath her authority was not only broken, it was impossible to reclaim. We didn't celebrate. There was no triumphant moment, no dramatic confrontation. There was simply relief, pride, a sense of justice quietly fulfilled. I looked around our home, the place that had been threatened, scrutinized, and challenged, and saw it as it had always been, a sanctuary, a space of safety, courage, and love. My son's presence reminded me that strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quietest moments, the silent endurance, the calm readiness that matters most. And then the final acknowledgement came, not from her, not directly, but from the community itself. Subtle nods, brief smiles, casual conversations revealing that they had seen the truth all along, that she had misused authority, and we had responded with clarity, calm, and courage. and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tide of public opinion turned entirely. The HOA's president was no longer feared, no longer respected. Her campaigns, her letters, her threats were met with quiet skepticism, disbelief, and in some cases, amusement. It was in that moment that I understood the depth of what had happened. This wasn't about a $5 fine, or petty authority, or even a single confrontation. It was about the universal truth that courage, integrity, and preparedness are forces no one can intimidate. That standing firm, even against absurd odds, changes the perception of everyone who witnesses it. And that the moral of the story is not about defeating one person. It's about the enduring power of principle and the legacy of dignity left in the wake of standing up. Weeks later, the neighborhood felt different. People approached us differently, interactions shifted subtly, and the tension that had once shadowed every glance and every letter dissolved entirely. The HOA president, once a looming figure of intimidation, became almost a cautionary tale, a reminder that fear and control can only achieve so much when faced with unwavering resolve. And as I sat in my home, watching the sunlight filter through the windows, I reflected on the lessons learned. Courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers through your actions, through your preparation, through the silent readiness to protect what you love. Authority built on fear is fragile, but integrity, dignity, and steadfastness are unbreakable. My son remained beside me, a quiet presence, a living reminder that real strength comes from preparation, training, and moral clarity. Together we had endured, we had resisted, and we had emerged unbroken. And in that quiet, unassuming victory, I understood something essential. This story, like life itself, isn't always about dramatic confrontations or cinematic clashes. Sometimes it's about the quiet, persistent endurance that outlasts every threat, every letter, every attempt at control. And finally, the HOA president's influence waned completely. Her letters ceased. Her threats were no longer taken seriously. And the neighborhood, once under her shadow, moved forward with a subtle but unmistakable shift in awareness. Power earned through fear is temporary. Power earned through respect, courage, and integrity endures. The moral, clear and undeniable, lingered like the sunlight that filtered through the trees outside. Some forces cannot be bent. Some families cannot be broken. And some lessons, once lived, once experienced, once quietly enforced through courage, cannot be forgotten. And as I looked at my son, the calm guardian of our home, the silent sentinel who had turned fear into certainty, I knew we had witnessed more than a battle over a $5 fine. We had witnessed a transformation, a triumph of courage, preparation, and unwavering resolve. And in that triumph, we had carved a story of dignity and strength that would endure far beyond any HOA, any letter, any threat, any fleeting authority. We didn't need to shout, we didn't need to strike. We simply stood firm, and in standing firm, we had changed everything. You've heard this confession, now wait until you hear the next one, the truth that shatters everything you thought you knew.